I wanted to begin our colloquium by asking some important questions. How will the heirs of intermarriage change Judaism? Can you be Jewish and rather than Jewish or? Can the Jewish world handle half Jewish? Or is being half Jewish no big deal anymore? These and many more questions arise when you pose the question we put in the title of the colloquium, half Jewish? And you can say it many ways. Half Jewish? Half Jewish? The articulation makes a difference. But behind these questions, before these questions, there's an even more basic question, and that is, what does it mean to be Jewish? If you define yourself as half something, what is all something? Is it a cultural identity? Is it the language one speaks? A set of religious beliefs and practices? A family heritage, an evolving civilization? Is it a genetic calculus? An ethnic identification that begins to sound racial the more and more we explore it? Half Jewish, a quarter Jewish? The answer is, of course, it's all of the above, and it's different for different individuals. Without a pope or a Sanhedrin, there is no one Judaism that can impose itself on everyone. Intermarriage has always been part of Jewish life, from the welcoming stories of Ruth and Esther, to the prohibitions of Deuteronomy and the Book of Ezra, to the modern global Jewish visual diversity that could only have been the result of genetic mixing. For the last generation of 40 years, intermarriage has been a significant reality in American Jewish life. From a quarter of marriages involving Jews in the 1970s to fully half of marriages involving Jews for the last 20 years. There are now thousands and thousands of partnerships and families that have been created, and there has been a lot of ink spilled on what should be done to address the situation. This weekend, we turn to look at the next generation, the tens of thousands of children who have been born with roots in multiple cultures and faith traditions. Even if, in the maximal wishes of most organized Judaisms, the non-Jewish partner converts, non-Jewish grandparents, family memories, cultural inheritance still remains. Some might accept and celebrate the, quote, half-Jewish label. Others might reject it very strongly. Some of the heirs of intermarriage claim no affinity with Judaism. Others identify completely, and many are someplace in between. If the American Jewish community wants to grow and to thrive, here is a population who, despite experiences of rejection, can nevertheless be willing to learn about who they are as they become who they will be. The question is, can we do better at understanding who they are, what they want and need, and how we can celebrate them as part of our Jewish family? Now, the challenge of the heirs of intermarriage begins with their parents' partnership. If we want to face the realities of these heirs, we have to understand a basic reality when it comes to their parents. And that is, intermarriage is inevitable in an open society. That's the backstory. That's the setting we have to understand. The American Jewish community is finally emerging from intermarriage denial. There was a hue and cry at the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey that showed that half of marriages involving Jews were to non-Jews. Now, at the root was a reasonable concern. What will happen in the future? How will the children be raised? Will they identify with the Jewish community? Unfortunately, the dominant attitude for too long, and still among far too many, is prevention. Be it condemnation, rejection, pressure, even attitude or rhetoric. And after 2 decades of prevention, intermarriage rates are about the same. And at what cost? At what damage to the Jewish connections of those families and partnerships formed over that time? The old story was, a man brought home a Native American woman as his fiancée, and he wanted to introduce her to his Jewish mother. He said, "Mother, I'd like you to meet my fiancée. Her name is Running Deer." And the mother held out a hand and said, "Sitting Shiva." That was the response. You're dead to me, forget it, goodbye. It's not like that today, in most cases. Not all, certainly, but in more and more cases, synagogues are more welcoming. When our founding rabbis in humanistic Judaism, Rabbi Dan Friedman and Rabbi Sherwin Wine, were working in Michigan and Chicago, they were doing 100 weddings a year. Sometimes 4 weddings in a weekend, 5 weddings in a weekend, because they were the only ones willing to officiate at intermarriages. In the 1970s, a new organization was formed called the Rabbinic Center for Research and Counseling. Didn't say intermarriage in the title. It was the secret list of rabbis who would do intermarriages. It wasn't published anywhere. You had to call a number and get the list mailed to you of who would do these ceremonies. And I mean, that was the attitude. It was a secret, and the rabbis didn't want it to be known. Some of them would only marry you in their study, not in a public ceremony. Well, that world is very different. I am nowhere near as busy as Dan Friedman and Sherwin Wine were back in the day, because there are plenty of other rabbis who are willing to officiate at these ceremonies. I'm still busy, but not as busy. And certainly many more congregations will accept these families as members. But we still have a way to go. In 1995, the Leadership Council of Conservative Judaism issued a statement on intermarriage, policies and approaches. They said, "We subscribe to a 3-tiered approach to intermarriage, beginning with attempts at prevention, then the promotion of conversion, and finally, when prevention and conversion fail to occur, keruv, involvement, welcoming to the mixed family." So after you've tried preventing the marriage, and then changing the objectionable part of the partner, if neither of those work, then do outreach. Or consider the title of a 2003 publication of the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs. Listen to the title. "Let's Talk About It. A book of support and guidance for families experiencing intermarriage and for synagogue leadership." It sounds like a drug addiction. Let's talk about it for those families experiencing this phenomenon. Conservative rabbis and cantors are prohibited from officiating or co-officiating at intermarriages, and only Jews may be members of conservative congregations. And this part of the 1995 statement I have to read verbatim. "Intermarriages should not be publicly acknowledged in any official synagogue forum. Congratulations may be extended to the parents or grandparents of a child born to an intermarried couple, provided that the child is Jewish, i.e. born of a Jewish mother. Or in the case of a non-Jewish child, if both parents have committed themselves to converting the child." Think about the implications of that for new grandparents who want to kvel over a grandchild. Now, the statement does conclude more positively. "Sensitivity should be shown to Jews who have intermarried and their families. We should offer them opportunities for Jewish growth and enrichment." Wouldn't have said that 20 years before. Now, the Reform movement can be more welcoming to those joining on the congregational level, even though still sometimes their official pronouncements could use some massage. The Rabbinic Association is still officially opposed to officiation, but there's no penalty if you do. And so a number of Reform rabbis, and a growing number of Reform rabbis, will officiate or even co-officiate. In fact, that's how I met Rabbi Mafik, who's on our panel. Her husband, also a rabbi, Rabbi Mafik, contacted me because he had heard that I also would officiate at intermarriages in the city, and he wanted to talk basically professionally, but also collegially. And it was a wonderful outreach and connection that has borne a lot of fruit. But that's the positive side of building community of open-minded people. Now, in 1982, the CCAR rejected co-officiation, and I have to share the language of this as well. In 1909, and again in 1947, and in 1973, the Central Conference of American Rabbis declared its opposition to the performance of mixed marriages by its members. Mindful of these prior resolutions, we now call special attention to the most flagrant form of mixed marriage, co-officiating with non-Jewish clergy, and publicly repudiate that practice. And even in the year 2000, their endorsement of officiation at same-sex ceremonies made sure to specify that the relationship of a Jewish same-gender couple is worthy of affirmation through appropriate Jewish ritual. Now, I am not blasé about the concerns about future generations that led to some of this, and I am not bringing up these details to criticize other movements on areas in which they are improving, and their good faith efforts to do what they believe is right, even though we in humanistic Judaism have been much more accepting for much longer. There's a couple I met when I first came to my congregation where they had gone to their family rabbi to get married. She'd met a wonderful young man at the University of Michigan, and he berated them in his office. "How could you do this? This is terrible." Well, her father went to see if he could work something out with the rabbi. No dice. But what was different there is her parents quit the congregation. They said, if you won't serve our kids, then we won't be here. Well, unfortunately, that hasn't happened enough. But those kind of stories about being lectured, and that's a lot more rare. Not gone, but more rare, and that's good. The American Reform movement accepting patrilineal descent was a positive step, a more accepting step. Although it should be noted that that doesn't apply elsewhere in the Reform world necessarily. Not every part of the Reform world across the globe accepts patrilineal descent. But it was a very important step. The outreach efforts, organizations like interfaithfamily.com, the Jewish Outreach Institute, Jews in All Hues, multi-heritage Jewish network. I mean, there's all kinds of these groups that are doing important work. The world is different today. We've not yet seen all of the positive impact of these organizational steps, as Paul Golan will talk about a little bit later. But the change is happening faster out there on the Jewish street, among non-professional, non-organized Jews. In the year 2000, the American Jewish Committee organized an annual survey of American Jewish opinion. They do this every year. But in the year 2000, for the first and to my knowledge the only time, they included a series of questions on intermarriage. And the results were not what they wanted at all. It showed the American Jewish public is far more accepting than the leadership of the reality of intermarriage. They asked, would it pain you if your child married a Gentile? 39% said yes, only 39%. The best response to intermarriage is to encourage the Gentile to convert to Judaism. Only 25% agreed. 50% agreed it is racist to oppose Jewish-Gentile intermarriages. And 80% agreed intermarriage is inevitable in an open society. They were asked about rabbinic officiation at intermarriages. And again, the difference is stark. When given the choice between choosing to not officiate at all, to only officiate if there is no Gentile clergy, or to co-officiate with Gentile clergy, 22% said the rabbi should refuse, 15% said they should only do it alone, but 57% said their rabbi should co-officiate, and 5% weren't sure. But if you want evidence of how the Jewish establishment responded, they didn't ask those questions again. And if you go on their website and you look up that survey, the results are there, but they're garbled on the page. It's almost the only part of that survey that looks like that. And it's looked like that for the last, I check back every couple of years, it's looked like that for the last 10 years. Now you can sort of decipher what it is. I've taken the data and made a chart for presentations I've done. But it's just not easy. They don't want you to know what the people out there believe. Now, why these differences between the organized professional Jews and the lay Jews? I would guess that most of the respondents to the survey have seen in their own family, even their own children, that intermarriage is inevitable in an open society. That marrying Mary or John was not painful because Mary and John are wonderful and nice people. They wanted a rabbi, hopefully their rabbi, to be at their child's wedding, even if they're marrying John or Mary. And they want a positive and a Jewish connection for future grandchildren who will be coming from this partnership. You see, the wedding couple doesn't need a rabbi to marry them. They can go to Las Vegas. They can go to a justice of the peace. Today you can get a friend ordained on the internet for $25. I know someone that ordained their cat on the internet. In many states, and a friend can register for the day and do the wedding. Or they could just not get married at all and be together and have a family. They're in love. They're building a life together with or without Jewish endorsement. Many of them want a Jewish endorsement. They come to a rabbi. They're asking for a positive connection. Some rabbis reject them with an oy vey, but some have learned to welcome them with a mazel tov. But the reality of intermarriage or interpartnership, the reality that the lay Jews have accepted, is that this is inevitable, and not just for Jews, by the way. You know, the old joke is that Jews are like everyone else, only more so. In 1961, when Barack Obama's presidents were married, fewer than 1 in 1,000 marriages involved black and white partners, and today it's 1 in 60. In 2008, 14% of new marriages were interethnic or interracial. And I'm not sure if that study counted an Irish-Italian partnership as an interethnic partnership. If not, the numbers are even higher. Intermarriage is inevitable. Love changes everything, even Judaism. This is the backstory. This is the setting, the context for today's heirs of intermarriage. And this is also the landscape they will find as they go out into the world to find partners for themselves. Now, the Jewish world has had conference after conference saying, what will happen to the kids? What will happen to the kids? Trying to play prophetic, seeing what's going to happen. Well, we in Humanistic Judaism are a non-profit organization. We want to see results. What has happened? While today's adult heirs of intermarriage were being conceived and raised, the strategy and rhetoric was prevent, manage, cope with. What have been the results? Well, the young adults we see now. Their experiences, their attitudes we explore this weekend, they are the product of choices made by their parents and by the Jewish community in the last decades. Let's find out what really happened. We begin with Professor Lynn Davidman, who previously spoke at Colloquium 2003, the last time she spoke with us, most recently, on the subject of the benefits of intermarriage, something you don't hear a lot about. You can get the sense she's willing to look at those sacred cows. She is currently the Robert M. Barron Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Religious Studies at the University of Kansas. She was previously a professor of Judaic Studies, American Civilization, and Gender Studies at Brown University, receiving a master's degree in Religion and Psychological Studies from the University of Chicago Divinity School. She earned her PhD at Brandeis University. She's the author of Tradition in a Rootless World, Women Turn to Orthodox Judaism, and its sequel, Tears in the Sacred Canopy, Leaving Orthodox Judaism, which she's currently working on and will be published soon. And she's also the co-editor of Feminist Perspectives in Jewish Studies. Her recent research has specialized on unaffiliated Jews and on race and Jewish identity. Now, what makes this colloquium program special is that after she speaks, our panelists of speakers and experts will come onto the stage to respond to her presentation, and you have a part to play as well in those cards that you received to write down comments and questions that will be collected by volunteers and shared with the panelists for their response as well. So please feel free to engage yourself in the presentation. And to begin our conference, I'd like to offer a warm welcome to Professor Lynn Davidman.
Good morning. Thanks to all of you for coming so bright and early on this nice day to hear me. I recognize many faces here from Colloquium 2003, and I want to say thank you for making me feel at home and bringing me back. I guess I did a good job the first time. I also want to ask you whether I have some kind of invisible S on my face. Yesterday, right when I walked into the hotel, this gentleman, Barry, asked me, "Are you going to be speaking to us this weekend?" I said, "How do you know?" He said, "You've just got that aura about you." Not sure what that refers to, but I'll take it as a compliment. I want to thank Adam for remembering me all these years later and inviting me to share my more recent work with you. I want to invite you to join me in giving Adam a huge yasher koach. May you go from strength to strength for his massive organizational skills. He had every detail of this conference down months ago. I kept trying to keep up with him, and all I had to do was worry about my one talk. To a virtuoso organizer and leader, I, with all of you, thank Adam and AJ, who was always there to respond to emails when Adam couldn't get to them in the next 10 minutes. Adam allowed me the title of my talk, which meant I could interrogate whatever I wanted. Which half? So, given the title of my talk, you can expect that I plan today to interrogate the whole notion of half-Jew. So I need to start with the very question of who is a half-Jew? What does it mean to say someone is a half-Jew? Has anyone ever heard of a half-Muslim, a half-Christian, or half-Catholic? Or what about a half-Zoroastrian? On this subject, I have a great line from Bill Maher, the late-night political comedian. He said, "I'm half Jewish and half Catholic, and I always bring my lawyer to confession." And of course, which half do we mean? which part of the body is the part that is Jewish and which is the part that is other? Maybe the Jewish part is the head, since so many of the Jewish people I've interviewed over this past 26 years have spoken with great pride of the Yiddish Kopf, the Jewish head, but literally, really, the Jewish mind. And of course, the parallel is the Goyish Kopf, not one we should have. In a study of unaffiliated Jews, all respondents told me that being Jewish for them means being part of a group of people who have produced many Nobel Prize winners, such as Einstein, Harold Pinter, Elie Wiesel, and Paul Krugman, the New York Times editorial writer, of whom I'm a great fan. In several research projects I have done, such as one based on interviews with people who had one Jewish and one non-Jewish parent, and my study of unaffiliated Jews, nearly everyone claimed this proudly, this identification with the great and famous. But can they legitimately claim that as Jews, they and all other Jews are smarter and more accomplished and more talented? And that's why they frequently use the term Yiddish Kopf or Goyish Kopf? Or is this simply self-congratulations? One issue that immediately becomes apparent to me is that in thinking about and interrogating what is a half-Jew and what sort of identity that is, we run right up against the question of what's a Jewish person? That is a very complicated question that does not lend itself to easy answers. Let's consider the most commonly used interpretations and answers, which are religion, nationality, ethnicity, and culture. If we think of Judaism as a religion, does that exclude all those who do not affiliate with any Jewish synagogues, temples, or organizations? Does it exclude secular Jews who don't think of themselves as religious? Or as Max Weber, the famous sociologist, said, as religiously unmusical, something I identify with? I wonder whether any of my respondents in these studies would fall if Judaism was defined solely as a religion. Even more importantly, the term religion is derived from Christianity and has been projected onto Jewish people as if there was some essential similarity such that Judaism can be defined using Christian categories. When I checked the Oxford English Dictionary for the etymology of the word religion, the first reference was to its origins in the classical Latin religio, which referred to a supernatural feeling of constraint, usually having the force of a prohibition or impediment, that which is taboo, a rule, and also a positive obligation signifying divine sanction, religious fear, awe, religious observance, religious practice, ritual, particular system of religious observance. In the 8th century, the term religious came to refer to a monastery. Now, clearly, that can't refer to Jews who don't believe in separation of the sexes and have no monastic tradition, thank goodness. Simply put, the word religion as it's used today derives from the Latin origin as well as from Christian authors. Jewish people don't all think of Judaism as a constraint or system of prohibitions, nor positive sanctions signifying divine retribution. Clearly, we have here this weekend many people whose sense of being Jewish has nothing to do with any sense of a divine power who obligates us to perform certain actions and forbids us from performing others. In 1533, and this is my last etymology, the French word for religion was used to refer to Protestants, as in religion meant, therefore, those of that particular religion. And I find, as a scholar who's been a student of religion for 26 years, that every time I go to a sociology of religion conference, the assumption is religion is defined by Christian terms. I was at an invitation-only conference in California one weekend, and on Sunday morning they said, well, what are we all doing here on a Sunday? And I said, I have no problem with that. Another way Judaism has been used is as a signifier of nation, another term relevant for Christians, such as the term that's used for the United States throughout its history as a Christian nation. The founding fathers took on this notion of a city on a hill, that they were going to found here in this country a new city on a hill, which was going to take the place of Jerusalem and be a light unto all nations. Jewish people cannot be identified by nationality because A, they come from all around the world, and B, we can't fully define Israel as a Jewish nation, and most of the world's Jews do not live in Israel and probably never will. Well then, can we define Judaism as an ethnicity? This term, which is derived from the Greek word ethnos, was originally translated as nation. That gets us into that same tautological problem of nation. Over the time, the word ethnicity or ethnos has acquired many different meanings, such as the notion of a nation or a people. The more modern use of ethnic group, as many dictionaries and reference groups explain, is of or relating to or characteristic of, covering all their butts, a sizable group of people sharing a common and distinctive racial, national, religious, linguistic, or cultural heritage. I'm going to say none of those fit. Ethnicity is a vague term which has diverse meanings to people. So it's entirely plausible that if someone was asked for her ethnic origin, she might answer the question with her own question, a very typically Jewish thing to do. How can I tell what ethnic origin I am? It may not be clear whether she's being asked about the country of her birth, the location where her parents were born, or her more distant ancestors. And how distant back do we go? The question might also refer to a description of her cultural traditions, such as food. Remember that old ad, you don't have to be Jewish to love Levi's? Same thing with bagels I discovered in Kansas, but they're all frozen. Also, cultural traditions could mean clothing, language, friendship networks, as well as appearance, such as hair type or color. We're all supposed to have dark curly hair, I guess, and facial structures. Speaking of Jewish facial structures, there was a great comment in an article in the Jewish Forward about Jewish noses that's attributed to Sander Gilman, a distinguished professor of American cultural history and literary history at Emory University, who's author of the book called The Jew's Body. He said, "The only thing I ever noticed about Jewish noses is that all Jews seem to have one." Attempts to ascertain Jewish ethnicity may well provide contradictory results, suggesting diverse ethnic origins. Within the social sciences, one group I affiliate with, the term ethnicity has come to be more generalized, and it refers to all human groups that regard themselves and are regarded by others as culturally distinct. And yet, since Jews have always lived amongst other people and adapted ways of life from the surrounding cultures, it's not so easy to say that Jews indeed partake of one single distinctive culture. In the definition of ethnicity cited above, a sizable group of people sharing a common and distinctive racial, national, The concept of race is highly problematic. We need to situate this term in the context of the U.S. in the 19th and early 20th centuries, an era in which immigrant groups were seen by the dominant white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. My husband, who read this talk, said, "I think you're anti-WASP." Anyway, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who dominated this country in the 19th century racialized all immigrant groups, by which I mean they divided all immigrant groups, Irish, Italian, Jews, Slavs, into races that had distinctive physical and mental traits that were biologically determined. During this period, nearly all immigrants were racialized, and if you're interested in this, I recommend a phenomenal book by Matthew Fry Jacobson called Whiteness of a Different Color, where I learned much of this. So immigrants were racialized, meaning divided into distinct groups with defined physical and mental traits. Scientists argued that skin color or facial structure was a window on internal characteristics, such as alcoholism, cheapness, or intelligence. Although the concept of race is based on biological differences, it's never referred solely to physical characteristics. Rather, it was also a matter of social values and inner essence. Immigrants were racialized as a way for the dominant white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to divide and conquer all these others coming to the U.S., excluding them from realms of power and decision-making which were originally granted only to free white men. That leaves a lot of us out. These racial divisions were given the imprimatur of science, for example, in the study of eugenics, which was quite popular in the late 1900s. And they argued, giving the stamp of science to their racism, said that only people in the superior classes, in fact, the great British stock, had ought to produce as many kids as possible to keep in control of this great nation and maintain the ideals for which our ancestors and us have always stood. These lower multitudes hadn't ought to spawn their less intelligent offspring, but then again, we need a supply of cheap labor. And where to better get it than encouraging these bops, hunks, and spigs, and so on, to raise as many mutts as they can. It is clear that those who could trace their ancestry to the Mayflower and their descendants, close and distant, feared that the sheer number of distinctive groups flooding this nation would undermine their nearly exclusive access to power and privilege. For a century preceding World War II, the dominant view in both Europe and the United States divided people into racial groups. Since the defeat of Nazi Germany, however, in the 40s, the idea of a Jewish race has been largely discredited by social scientists, social theorists, and producers and consumers of popular culture. Hitler's reliance on racial notions of Jewishness to implement the Nazis' extermination policy rendered the application of race to Jews as sinister and anti-Semitic. And I want to say the original laws of return in Israel, shockingly, were defined by the Nuremberg laws. You had to have at least a tiny drop of blood. After World War II, racial distinctions referred only to color, while ethnicity, that highlighted a new term that highlighted culture, was applied to Jews and other white European groups. Ethnicity and nation, religion, and culture are thereby terms imposed by others on Jews. In my studies based on interviews with unsynagogued Jews and adult children of intermarriage, however, I found that in this era of multiculturalism and identity politics, many contemporary Jews actually continue to employ a biological essentialist understanding of Jewishness. Their reliance on ascribed characteristics as central to their identities in an era in which the idea of a Jewish race has been debunked, and when most scholars eschew racial categorizations, is quite surprising. Many people I interviewed said, well, you know, it's in my blood. It's just who I am. I'm like those great Nobel Prize winners. I think why Jews continue to want to define themselves in these essentialist categories would make for a great doctoral dissertation. Anyone who has a student, send them to me. Although none of the terms usual terms used to describe Jewish people are a good fit, there must be some people who have fashioned some working definition of being Jewish, because there are many people who describe themselves proudly as half-Jews and who have a presence in literature and on the internet. One advocate for this term is Susan Jacoby, the author of the book Half-Jew, A Daughter's Search for Her Family's Buried Past. In this book, she asks the thorny question of what exactly or who exactly is a Jewish person from an interfaith perspective. Jacoby told of her approach to affirming her Jewishness, which was by insinuating herself into Jewish cultural life. Obviously, getting involved with Jewish culture is a lot easier on the coasts or in big cities, but is very hard to find in those small Midwestern towns where most of my students come from. In an interview on NPR, Jacoby said that Alfred Kazan first suggested the term half-Jew as a title for her book. It resonated with the title of his own book, which really referred to full Jews, but his book was called New York Jew. So he thought having a book called New York Jew and Half Jew would be a good little pairing. She said, like Kazan, I wanted to confront an epithet, Jew, and turn it into something positive. In emphasizing that the term Jew is an epithet, which is why I keep saying Jewish person, Jewish people, she wrote that the preferred term to use when referring to someone of Jewish ancestry or a member of the Jewish people is Jewish, although Jew is, of course, technically correct. The word Jew, however, has become laden with negative connotations and is often used in a pejorative way. We can see this usage in anti-Semitic rhetoric that refers to dirty Jews and uses Jew as an insulting noun rather than as an adjective referring to a person. As a result, Jacoby wrote, it sounds jarring to her to hear someone referred to as a Jew rather than Jewish or a Jewish person. Furthermore, the word historically has been used to describe the feeling of being cheated out of something, as in, boy, that person Jewed me down. First time I heard that phrase, I was just astonished. It shows this Shylock image of Jews as greedy swindlers. Jacoby's book was one way she attempted to bring the concept of half-Jews into the mainstream. By titling her book in this way, she has had to wrestle with the question of whether Judaism is an innate biological identity, or it's just a feeling, not just, more importantly, a feeling of Jewishness, a feeling of being part of Jews. She wrote, in grappling with the meaning of being Jewish for herself and her own identification, she wrote, it is hard to think of conversion as a blinding light on the road to Damascus, or as a highly spiritual or intellectual process, when the light comes from a flickering television screen, the voice of the deity is Bishop Sheen, and you have drilled your father on his catechism answers. I was troubled at a young age by the very idea that just by pouring water over someone's head, you could change her relationship to God. Her own question about who she was led her to strongly feel that no matter who the parents are, if children were to be raised as Jewish, they should be raised only in the one single religion and not learning about several different religions. Another example of writings that makes use of the term half-Jew is the online community called the Half-Jewish Network. This network was started in 2005 by Robin Margolis, who 10 years earlier, in 1995, had co-authored a book called Between Two Worlds, Choices for Grown Children of Jewish-Gentile Intermarriage. In this book, they wrote, "We are born in two cultures and spend the rest of our lives traveling back and forth between them." There's that old image of the wandering Jew. Most of us eventually settle in a primary religio-ethnic country of residence, but choosing it is a lengthy and complex process. She has also founded Parava, the Alliance for Adult Children of Jewish-Gentile Intermarriage. Parava refers to foods that are neither dairy nor meat. Jewish law allows these foods to be eaten at any meal, in contrast to the clear separation of meat and milk that ancient rabbis codified into law, deriving from the fact that the Hebrew scriptures say 3 times, "Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk." Obviously, that means you should wait 6 hours after eating meat to have your ice cream cone. Margolis chose the term half-Jewish for her internet network because, she said, an internet survey showed that half-Jewish was the term most adult children and other descendants of intermarriage identify with. In her blog, Margolis expresses great disappointment that the Jewish community does not reach out to people in her situation the way it now reaches out to interfaith couples. My story, she said, and the story of the Half-Jewish Network may hold some clues. I'm a child of an Orthodox Jewish mother and an Episcopalian WASP father. My husband's Episcopalian, was raised Episcopalian. The only way I could introduce him to my family by saying that his mother's original name was Schwartz, which was true. I said, don't ever get caught in a shower room with them. I learned, she said, I was raised Episcopalian and not told that my mother was a Jew. I learned the truth in 1984, shortly after my mother's funeral, when I was a very young woman. I had long ago lost faith in my Christianity. I had an intense spiritual experience and resolved to live my life as a Jew and took on my mother's surname. Her father and her 3 Christian-identified brothers were horrified, and the decision led to a family breach that took years to heal. Her Christian grandmother never spoke to her again. A conservadox cousin who ran her mother's extended family made it clear she was not welcome. Only her Jewish bubby was willing to have a relationship with her. As she writes, the Jewish community of the 1980s did not want interfaith couples, never mind adult children of intermarriage. I started the Half-Jewish Network in September of 2005 because the adult children and other descendants of intermarriage need the same resources available to them that are now available to interfaith couples: advocacy organizations, literature, and Jewish outreach. She feels that Jewish communities continue to neglect and show coldness towards adult children of intermarriage. There are socially acceptable ways of treating adult children of intermarriage that would never be acceptable to anyone else, including the intermarried themselves. Now I go to the objections to the term half-Jew, which is kind of problematic, especially when many of the people I interview say, I'm Jewish. I'm simply Jewish. In contrast to Margulis's blog and others, for example, one called Jewlicious, don't ask me to go there, there is also a strong internet presence of those who object to the particular term half-Jew. One site and group calls itself Beta Gershom. Beta means house of, it's the Hebrew word bayit, and Gershom is the name of the son Moses from the Bible, and his Midianite wife produced. Let's not say we're condemning Moses back then. The reason they use this terminology to address people with Jewish and Gentile ancestry is that often people growing up in an intermarried family wonder whether they are a Jew and what nation they belong to. Many of the Jewish movements, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and I use the term movements rather than denominations because denominations is a Protestant word. I try to keep the Protestants away from us. So they disagree on the question of who's Jewish, and this caused grave concerns for American Jews in their relationships with Israel. A Brown graduate, a young woman who had majored in Jewish studies, she was a student of mine, wrote a series of articles in the Rhode Island Jewish Journal about her move to Israel and the challenges of settling into Israeli life. Given the bureaucracy, if you've ever been there, you know exactly what she's talking about. But in one angry essay, she told readers that in order for her to marry an Israeli Jewish man, she was subjected to extensive inquiry over a period of months to make sure that she was indeed Jewish, an identity she had taken for granted her entire life. The various Jewish movements disagree about who is a Jew because in the Hebrew Bible, it does not state explicitly whether a child of intermarriage is or is not a part of Israel. An author writing on the blog Beta Gershom wrote of the promise made to Jacob in his dream of the ladder, stating that he is with his people, the Israelites, and will keep them wherever they go. And here I quote from the blog. The promise of Jacob is open to all offspring of Jacob. That is why at Beit Gershom, we welcome all offspring of Jacob, no matter how remote their Jewish ancestry may be. And we honor how each person self-identifies without imposing the definitions of any Jewish movement or their prerequisites. The site advocates not using the term half-Jewish or part Jewish because those terms can lend themselves to the erroneous impression that a person can be partially Jewish. We have coined the term Beta Gershom as a synonym for a person of Jewish and non-Jewish ancestry. A similar position is taken by a respondent in the conversation on the blog, The Half-Jewish Network. She wrote, "It sounds like a wonderful organization you have started and one that is much needed. I wish, though, you would stick with the term adult children of intermarriage rather than half-Jew. I don't believe there's such a thing as a half-Jew. Of course, there are some people who are searching for a spiritual home or are in transition, you know, those old-fashioned Jewish wandering Jews. But in general, either a person has committed and proclaimed herself to be a Jew or they haven't. And if committing and proclaiming was good enough for our matriarchs in the Bible, it's surely good enough for us." This sense of being shunned and seen as an outsider by people who think they know what Jews are, was expressed by several of the 15 children, adult children of intermarriage, I and my student Rachel have interviewed over the past couple of months. Cameron, who identifies as a Jew and was raised by a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, told of a conversation she had on a flight back from Israel. She said, "I sat next to this Orthodox lady, and she asked me about my religion, and I said I was Jewish. So she immediately asked, 'Is your mother Jewish?' And I said no. She whipped out her prayer book, or at least I think that's what it was, and she said, 'By law, you are not Jewish.'" And I didn't want to have to deal with that. I heard from so many people I'm not Jewish because my mom isn't Jewish. But I want to associate myself with Judaism. Although I don't know everything about the religion, that makes her no different from most American Jews. There is still a strong connection, not to the religion, but to the people. I was really pissed off that the woman told me that according to Jewish law, I'm not who I think I am. She denied my own sense of my identity. In contrast to these examples, the large majority of our respondents spoke of identifying as Jewish because it is in their extended Jewish families or their Jewish summer camps that they felt a sense of belonging and of being at home. Cindy told us that her father's Jewish family greatly appealed to her. It was the sense of family that I saw with my dad's side, the sense that you are Jewish, we are Jewish, and that all brings us all together. There's a connectedness that comes from all the history the Jewish people have gone through, the Holocaust, the Inquisition, pogroms, and so many other threats that have brought us closer together because we're associated, whether with the religion or not. That's one thing they had in common no matter where they were from. Several respondents spoke so fondly and happily of spending their summers at Jewish summer camps, where they felt a profound sense of belonging. All campers, counselors, and other people there, the nurses, the doctors, the administrators, were all part of one big, caring family. Cheryl mentioned that in contrast to her small town in Kansas, where the Jewish population is tiny, at summer camp it felt great to be around many Jews and to have the opportunity to see how similar and also how different we all were. But no matter what, everyone was accepted and welcome. A colleague of mine in sociology, whom I interviewed for this project, identifies as Jewish. He was born into a large Jewish family on his mother's side and a smaller non-Jewish family on his father's side. He described how these different family cultures shaped his identity when he was growing up. He said, "The big family seemed much more striking and visible. When I say that I feel Jewish, what does that really mean? I have dozens of relatives who identify as Jewish, and I have known them for a long, long time. There are many other cultural and other traits that are Jewish that we manifest all the time. There's a flavor or a quality that feels very familiar." I pushed. "Can you define that flavor or quality?" And he kibitzed. "That's actually an interesting question, like the old line about pornography. I know it when I see it." Pressed by pesky me for more, what the quality he thought characterized his large Jewish family was, he explained that Jewish culture, at least for over 1,000 years, went through a phase of never having experienced Puritanism. His Jewish family was loud, noisy, argued all the time. No Puritan hushness, asceticism to these people. There's not much Puritan quietness and restraint. My Jewish family members are all energetic and talkative. Jewishness is largely a function of belonging to a social group. What else would a sociologist say? It has always felt to me to be primarily cultural. Historically, particularly in the 1800s, one of the reasons that led Jews to define themselves primarily as a religious group was, if you think about when the original Reform movement started, the idea was to say, we are a religion just like the rest of you. We're not a certain kind of people you can keep apart. We are just like the rest of you. Judaism is a religion. But when his words resembled those of a student we spoke with. When asked, what does she feel when she goes to the Lawrence Jewish Community Center, she said, I feel at home. The sense of belonging she felt there, or others felt in their Jewish families, summer camps, and communities, were mentioned by all of our respondents, reminding me of Zborowski and Herzog's book, Life is with People, whose very title reveals their depiction, nostalgic really, of Eastern European Jewish culture in the US before World War II. In the context of American individualism and its emphasis on people's ability to choose and construct their own identities, the so-called half-Jews resemble the majority of American Jews who have adapted these notions of identity as a choice from the larger society we live in. Sociologist Peter Berger has described contemporary American culture as offering a supermarket of religious alternatives, where a person can choose to be Hindu one day, Buddhist another, and a Christian on the third. But in contrast to Berger's argument, which is that weakens their commitment, knowing they could choose to be anything, I argue that their awareness of choice strengthens their commitment because they know they can make other choices, and this is what they're choosing. This dimension of choice leads to all kinds of syncretism, the combination of elements from different sources. That's my last page. A clear way to understand this term of syncretism is to think of Hanukkah bushes. Our respondents described interesting experiences of religious syncretism in their interfaith families. For example, Anne's Jewish mother tried to create an inclusive household in which her father's traditions would not be left out. She creatively combined both traditions in creating a Christmas stocking for Anne. She said it was made from Hanukkah fabric. I still have it, and I put it up for decoration. It was something my mom made for my friends as well. It would have been something in it even if it wasn't Christian-oriented, something like a pair of socks or a few pieces of candy. It was her way to show that although the family is Jewish, she understands that my dad is Christian and she's Jewish, and she wants to be as inclusive as possible. I like that open door policy. My student Rachel, who worked with me on this paper, went home a few weeks ago to celebrate Passover and Easter with her father's Jewish and her mother's Catholic family. She created a vivid description of the concurrent preparation for both holidays. When she arrived at home, she immediately began to cook with her mother. She said, my mom grabbed a baking sheet, our oldest and the most worn one, the one with the memories and flavors of my childhood deeply ingrained into it. And she placed the kishki on the tray. It's hard to define kishki, but I ate it as a kid. I think it's intestines in this plastic casing. I used to like it. Anyway, Rachel and her mom were quite excited by this baking kishki in the oven. And she said, as she placed it in the oven, I could feel the excitement build, waiting for the casing to burst open to reveal tiny bits of deliciousness. not to say fat, reminiscent in so many ways of my childhood, a connection to my Judaism. As the kishki baked in the oven, my mom and I began boiling water for the jello we would soon be pouring into tiny little perfect egg molds. We also started to paint eggs in those wonderful pastel colors. When asked what was most important to them about being Jewish, most of our respondents spoke of in fact, all of them spoke of the ethical commitments they felt were at the heart of Jewish life. For example, my colleague David responded to the question by saying, "What matters in my family is ethical values, and that is serious to all of us. We internalize it deeply." The idea that ethics would be linked to a specific ethnic heritage was recognized by all of us. Two of our college students responded in similar terms. When Anne was asked, were there any particular values, rituals, worldviews that your parents reinforced through your childhood? She told us that she was taught to accept people for who they are, to help people, and to be the best person she can be. These are the values that reinforced daily and that make me fortunate for who I am. Kathy also spoke of her profound respect for Jewish ethics and values. She said, "My parents chose to raise me Jewish because they thought that Judaism requires that your actions be based on a sense of conscious responsibility for their impact. This does not necessarily require any religious aspect of Judaism, but the culture stresses being generous, responsible, and putting other people first. For spring break, instead of going to Cancun with my buddies or wherever, I spend time with my parents and grandparents because it's the right thing to do." So this notion of ethics was mentioned in common by all people I interviewed in my study of children of intermarriage, in my study of unaffiliated Jews. And so, since this was mentioned by them, the power of Jewish values in their identities, and I'm out of time to deconstruct what Jewish ethics are or might be, I'm going to end this talk on Jewish, I'm going to take this chance to end by saying, we're all people with strong ethical values. Mazel tov.
I wanted to ask you a question that came out of the end of your talk. And it also goes back to the beginning of the talk as well. It has to do with the question of chosenness. That one of the strategies for Jewish survival was always thought to be the sense that we are better, or the best, even more appropriately. And so why would you want to be anything less than the best? Why would you want to join anything else? Why would you want to talk to anyone else? Why would you certainly want to marry anyone else? That old background of the Yiddische Kopf and the Goyische Kopf had a behavioral side to it, that you wouldn't want people to mix with the wrong kind. And what I find is, just as you've described this persistence of a biological definition going through people's self-definition, there's also a persistence of a chosenness in the kind of terms they continue to use, whether it's, well, we have ethical values. Well, that is true, and others do, and we have problematic ethics too in certain ways. You mentioned separation of the sexes. We don't have it in one sense, and we certainly do have it, unfortunately, in other ways. And the same is true for the Nobel Prize winners and the intelligence stuff. I mean, it's a kind of modified chosenness. Right, it's self-congratulatory, exactly. And I wonder if you think that, I mean, are there problems with this kind of mentality going forward, given that they do have a non-Jewish part of the family that has Goyish Kopf all over the place, and yet they still love them? And at the same time, for the organized Jewish community to find the right balance between self-esteem, I value being Jewish, without chauvinism of we are the best.
Okay, I agree with Adam totally. There is this self-congratulatory element in thinking we're the best, we're the Nobel Prize winners, and it makes me rather uncomfortable. And I didn't have time to interrogate yet that too. What are Jewish values? Are there good Jewish values? What's going on in Israel? But there is a real issue about thinking we're so perfect and no one else matches us.
Any of the panelists have questions or reactions to the presentation? Sure. All right.
In terms of the last part of what you were talking about with the syncretism, what about religiosity and theology? Did you hear of people trying to blend two different theologies? Okay.
I did not really hear of people trying to blend theologies because Judaism does not place much emphasis on theology at all. Theology is really a Christian and a Catholic matter. Rather than spending their time thinking about angels and the afterlife, most Jewish rabbis concern themselves, and we have volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of interpretations of what the ancient scriptures might have meant and what they mean in our times. So it's hard to blend a Jewish theology because I'm not sure what it is. Judaism actually has no creed. I was arguing with or talking with a brilliant Jewish philosopher this past week as I prepared my talk. And he said, well, Judaism doesn't have a theology. And I said, well, then what do we have? He said, that's a good question. Who spoke in the Talmud? That's his way of being really smart-ass. But I don't think that people are trying to blend Jewish theology because Judaism really places emphasis on practice rather than abstract theologizing.
Any others? Please. Just make sure to talk close to the mic, both for posterity and for the audience.
I wonder about education. In your talks with people, what is it that they thought they should have either received, or what would be the correct or the best education that they would want to give to their children, thinking of future generations, I mean, their grandchildren? That's one point. The other is, what if you had the opportunity, did they discuss what they would have liked to do together as Jews? Was it more celebration? Was it also issues of comforting Jewishly, remembering Jewishly? That's it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to write down what Sivan was saying so that I could remember all the details. The second question is easier to answer. Yes, comforting Jewishly was part of what they thought. Celebrating Jewishly was huge. Belonging was huge. Those were the main things they emphasized that they felt made them love being Jewish. As to Jewish education, some were very grateful for their summer camps where they felt that's where they learned about being Jewish. Some regretted not having enough knowledge about what it meant to be Jewish. But what would I think they should learn? I can't say. I'm not prescriptive. As a sociologist, I get to shy away from that.
Rabbis get to do the prescriptions.
Right.
A couple of comments from the audience I wanted to bring in. One comment wanted to highlight the fact that identities are often not even either or. In this case, her daughter-in-law is Muslim, her son is indifferent. Her oldest grandchild goes to Catholic school because it's the best private education in the area. She learned about Passover at school where they had a Seder with the 12 disciples, And so it's really a little all of the above. It's not even Catholic Jewish or Protestant Jewish. Even if those may be common patterns, they're not universal. And another comment that was made about the use of the term Jew as an epithet, which I thought was a very interesting comment you had, that sometimes the enunciation makes a difference. So this person compares it to listening to a 1950s Southern sheriff talking about Negroes, when at the time the United Negro College Fund was the acceptable term for that group. But the way it was pronounced displayed the disrespect, and sometimes the term Jew can have the same kind of feature to it. Any other responses on the panels? No? Please, Yoni. Close.
So you were talking a little bit about both the issue of sort of chosenness, which is really a way to create borders and boundaries, and ultimately in the evolution of whiteness, and race and ethnicity, being Jewish was, let's say for the past 1900 years, imposed on you by others. And it wasn't until, let's say, the first French Republic that people were even given the opportunity to trade in their identity as Jewish for something else. To some extent, if there are no more borders and boundaries, is there any essentialism? Is there any, if intermarriage represents potentially sort of the introduction of new ideas at the boundaries, which can make them their way into the mainstream, and also Jewish values representing themselves more universally, if there are no boundaries anymore, then other than us calling ourselves Jewish, is there Jewish anymore?
That's a huge question. I imagine many rabbis have spent generations and generations trying to figure that out, as Jews have always taken from the countries around them. So even though we're speaking about blurring of boundaries in the US and around the world these days, the boundaries that maintain communities' segregation, Jews have never always had, not never, but most throughout their times have always participated with their larger cultures in which they live. So I'm not sure that our notion that at one point there were boundaries and now they've dissolved is quite right. I think there's some nostalgia there. What is Jewish if we take away boundaries? I think, and this is such a from the ground up sociological kind of idea. Jewish will be what Jewish people decide it will be. That's what it's really always been, and that's what it will continue to be. Is that a little slippery out of there?
Yes, I have one. I was very interested in your brief comment about syncretism, because the Jewish community is extremely uncomfortable. A large part of the Jewish community is extremely uncomfortable with that concept. So is there anything more that you can tell us about the people you spoke to and how they dealt with that idea?
Well, I'm going to, instead of speaking about the people I spoke to, go way back in history. So Jewish people don't like the idea of syncretism. Nevertheless, in Jewish history, there have been times of humongous breaks from what came before and what's coming next. So when you think of the destruction of the ancient temples and the replacement of sacrifice at the temple by synagogues, I mean, that's syncretism. Jews didn't used to have many places of worship. Where'd they get that from? Or when you think of the Enlightenment and rationality and the growth of Reformed Jews, that was syncretism too. We don't say Reformed Jews aren't Jewish, though. So I think the Jewish community that does eschew the notion of syncretism might be closing at least one eye.
Well, on the subject of syncretism, I think the way that the Jewish history we've dealt with it, I could imagine in 100 years every Jewish family will have a Christmas tree during Hanukkah, and we'll tell a story that the Maccabees planted a tree after they liberated the temple. And that explains
love
it.
that.
And I think a lot of our rituals are like that. But I'm curious, in sort of along those lines, in your conversations. Absolutely, absolutely. That's the story. They brought the seed down from Nazareth. But to the extent that you spoke with people, the way that you were talking, I had a sense of some of the comments that you were getting seemed to be more reactive. This is how I feel. Accepting Judaism, to some extent, it is what it is, and I'm looking for my place in it, as opposed to what I saw from Maya last night, which was just an incredible creativity and an assertion of ownership over the Jewish future based on the fact that if the majority of Jews are now going to be people who come from multiple cultures in their own nuclear family, that means that if that majority took ownership, that would be the majority. And so I'm curious if you're hearing that to a large degree or to a small degree or not at all.
Few people are as creative as Maya. So I don't think too many of my respondents could have pulled off what she did last night. But I think that the people who said, I am Jewish, that's it, do have a sense that that's what they're going to pass on and that that's the way Judaism will continue.
I wanted to bring in a couple of audience questions as well. There are two that are somewhat related. One was, do you have any comments on half-Jewish people who choose to identify with the non-Jewish half of their heritage, or did most of them identify as Jewish that you talked to? And related to that, American so-called half-Jews are sometimes pressured by the overwhelming power of Christian culture in which they live, and does this define religion and limit a sense of Jewish culture for them? So it's sort of not the positive affirmation or the self-assertion or even there's something lingering I want to pass on, it's the people who've chosen the other direction.
I say that for the people who've chosen the other direction, may the goddess smile upon them too. Let many flowers bloom. And your second part of the question was?
The power of outside Christian culture.
I think that all Jews, even the most Haredi and Hasidic, are influenced by the outside culture. There is no way to avoid it. One example that comes to mind immediately, in my first book, I studied people who became Orthodox, and one of the groups I studied was the Lubavitchers, who are well known for their mitzvah mobiles and for stopping people on the street. You're Jewish? You're Jewish? Here, some candles. Here, some tefillin. And they make use of secular culture to an amazing extent. I've seen a film they had of a bunch of Lubavitchers going to the Soviet Union and lighting this 10-story tall menorah, and that was broadcast worldwide. Is that avoiding the influence of culture? I mean, many Hasidim now need to use the internet for their business. Who knows what else they might be looking at there?
Sivan had one.
I think that certainly we're facing a time, I was going to say new age, but that has other, thanks. A time where it is very similar to the times that are described in the Bible. Doesn't really matter if they've actually occurred that way or not, but the story is very similar in the sense that syncretism was very popular in biblical times. And Jews had many spiritual centers, not one. There was never a time when there was one temple, maybe only the first one, the Mishkan, which they carried with them through the desert. But any other time they had more than one spiritual center, and any other time they had more than one God, and many languages, and their culture always was the kind of dialogue that Dan referred to sometime talking about their past or inventing their past. So I think very similar to those times, we are in them today. And I think that if we realize that in a way there's nothing new, then we can think about a promised future. And I think that if we look at the way intermarriage was so popular during the biblical times, even if some people like Ezra didn't like it, it certainly was the overwhelming majority. And the way I think that you mentioned before, the self-definition and the way people see themselves is very important. And I think that talking to in a situation where there was an audience in Israel, and we were talking about how do people feel, if they feel Jewish or not. And I just want to sort of interject another notion that is, I think, important. It certainly prevails in Israeli life when people do not describe themselves as Jewish, but describe themselves as Israeli and think that their identity combines this notion, and they don't want to be stuck as Jewish. What happens to their children? Will we call them intermarried, Jewish and Israeli? Are we creating a whole new concept? Does that mean that we're finally becoming a normal country and we're similar to what's happening here in North America? I wanted to know what your thoughts are about this.
I guess the first thing I want to comment on is what Sivan said about how in the Bible intermarriage was indeed very common. And like I said in my talk, Moses married a non-Jewish person. And I think that throughout every single age in which they've lived, Jews have always thought, oy vey, we're dying out. And if you think about it, most cultures throughout history have been apocalyptic. So even when I get to feeling despair about American politics and what's going on these days, and listen to some of the people on the other side, I think, what's going to happen to us? And I think, you know what? People have asked that since the beginning of time, and somehow there's still people asking this, and I don't have a crystal ball. I sometimes get called by radio people who say, well, with this cult and that cult happening, what do you think's going to happen? I say, I'm sorry, I can tell you what I see around me. I can analyze it, but I don't have a crystal ball, so predicting the future, I don't feel comfortable doing. But I do think that if in Israel, in fact, the same thing happens that's happening here, people will still find a way to continue and to identify, and it will take on new meanings with each generation. But I don't believe at all that such a stubborn-necked people will ever die out.
One of the other interesting features of modern Jewish life is that you can have a Jewish-Jewish intermarriage. Politically, religiously, culturally, Ashkenazi, Sephardi. I mean, it's not like we're all from the same village next to Lodz anymore. We're very, very diverse. Please.
We have been called the ever-dying people. And I think,
And there's a rebirth to that term now.
right, but look, I think what's fascinating actually is if you look at the way that Israeli culture has sort of diverged in terms of seeing themselves as, many of them, as Israeli and not Jewish, and how American Jewish culture, many folks see themselves as, they see the Jewish component as religious in the Christian sense of religious, and have either accepted or rejected that. In fact, many of the folks who are coming from Israel to the United States and experiencing American Judaism, or are going from the States to Israel and experiencing Israeli Jewish living, are actually integrating those and finding a holistic Jewish identity in a way that is that is interesting and separate from the way that they've diverged in each of these two different places. And I think that that's one of the interesting things that has happened over the past 60 years at most, but definitely since the 70s or 80s, as each sort of culture has found its own way within its sort of dominant culture.
Any other comments?
A question about Europe. Was part of your work done in Europe as well? Do you?
I haven't had the fortune to travel there much. But I do want to say something.
Please, please.
I do want to say something in response to what Sivan said about Israelis saying, well, I'm Israeli, so I don't have to be Jewish. Sivan knows what's going on in Israel infinitely better than I do. But I'm writing a book now, hoping to finish it by August, finally, on defectors from Hasidic life. I'm a defector myself, not from Hasidism, but from Orthodoxy. And I interviewed people who were defectors both in the United States and in Israel. And one thing I found is that in the United States, when people leave their Hasidic communities, they really don't know how to define themselves as Jews, because being brought up as a Hasid, they're taught this is the only way to be Jewish, and everything else is Goyish. The Reforms are Goys, the Conservatives are Goys. So people who leave Hasidic life aren't sure what it means for them to be Jewish. Whereas the people I interviewed in Israel said to me, look, I live in Israel. The clock is Jewish. The calendar is Jewish. There's no buses on Saturday. The restaurants aren't open in Jerusalem on Friday night. How could that not be Jewish?
There's actually a Hebrew term for that population. I learned the last time I was in Israel. It's datlash, which is lati l'she'avar, someone who was religious and left it. But I heard that there's also a new term that evolved recently called datlash lash, which is someone who left and then decided to go back. So there's a lot of movement in both directions. And in this country, there's a whole movement of people that call themselves OTD, which stands for off the derech, where they've left this world. There's a book that just came out this last year with a woman named Deborah Feldman about her leaving the Satmar Hasidim world. I mean, it's a whole phenomenon and possibly a subject for a future discussion. That's right, and those who return to the question as opposed to returning to the answer. Exactly. Yeah, I know. So I did get a couple comments from the audience I want to work in as well. One was commenting that Hanukkah bush is a little dated. Now it's called Chrismica or Hanumas. You can work either way.
Kansas must be late in the time.
That's right. There was also a question that wanted to draw on, I think, primarily your reading and research with Susan Jacoby's book and also, to some extent, Robin Margolis, and that is many adults learn later in life they are half Jewish. The Jewish side is sort of kept a family secret or it's just not talked about. They find out later. How might this affect their ability and willingness to identify with their Jewish past, and what does it mean, both the instant of identifying and also long-term?
I think that's a great question. And Sandra, what was the Supreme Court justice who found? Right, Sandra, not a,
Yeah.
right, Madeleine Albright found that out late. And I think she is an example of those people who, despite how late they find out, do embrace that part of their heritage. And there are many memoirs by, one of my favorite authors is Mary Gordon, who was raised Catholic, and at some point she found out that her father was Jewish, and she wrote a whole book talking about the shock of that and then the need to embrace that. So among the books I've read, and I try not to generalize beyond what I know, but in the books I've read, in the memoirs, people say, this is a part of who I am. I'd better find out, and not just say, too late.
I wanted to take us back to one last question that we started with, and that is the question of terminology. We are always trying to, in the Jewish world, figure out who the heck we are. And what does it mean to be? I am Jewish. I wake up in the morning. I realize I'm born into a family. I realize I'm Jewish, but what does that mean? Is it the same as being male? Is it the same as being from Michigan? Is it the same as where I live now? These are some of the questions that you explored at the beginning. And as a sociologist, it's easy to say, well, none of the terms work well. Period. End of paper. But out there in the inspirational Jewish world, we have to come up with a better answer than make up your own answer. I mean, sometimes that is the right answer, but sometimes we have to be a little bit more helpful. So I wanted to explore what possible terms might work. I mean, there were some things you said about ethnicity that I thought might still apply, you know, the sense of a common cultural identity, or I liked in particular what you said sociologists have redefined that to mean in terms of the, what it basically, when a group calls itself, or other people call it a self-defined group, then it has a meaningful term. And so even if Jews in Ethiopia and Jews in India and Jews in Azerbaijan and Jews in the Maghreb in North Africa and Jews in Poland were very different racially in terms of features, linguistically, language, food, clothing, all of those externalities. They did nevertheless have some common features in terms of holy language or holidays celebrated, but even more importantly, they had a sense of themselves as being part of the same thing, even if it was very different as it was articulated. So I think the term ethnicity may have some legs on it still. It's not quite in the grave. But the other term that I like to use in my congregation is the term of family, that it's maybe an ethnic family, but it's a Jewish family. And I find the term family works very well because it has a sense of belonging you talked about. It was one of the key terms that they themselves came up with in your study. But it also is an open definition. I'm part of my wife's family. She's part of my family, whether she likes it or not. You know, we get connected to each other's families by marriage. It's an open relationship. And so if you are welcomed into the Jewish family, it's not an exclusive definition. You're not only in one part of your family. You're a part of both parts of your family. I think that that's a more open model. It's more accepting to the audience, which may be a mixed audience of self-identified Jews and non-Jews, and certainly to the heirs of intermarriage who feel a foot in both worlds, but saying you're in the Jewish family can be an effective way to welcome them to the Jewish family.
I'm comfortable with that term family, especially because family has so many multiple meanings now. I remember when Jimmy Carter was president, he tried to convene a White House conference on the future of the family. And the conference never happened because nobody could agree on what the family was. So as families are increasingly open to self-definition, gay marriage has been legalized in many states. I think family works well because it's an open term. It evolves, it changes like the Jewish people do and the ways they identify.
In thinking about this question, what we're getting at in terms of a commonality, certainly one thing that struck me last night, which was my first ever secular humanistic service, do we still call it a service? Celebration, was the use of Hebrew. And I guess I shouldn't have assumed one way or the other, but Hebrew is still in every movement. And there's no conversation like happened in the 60s among Roman Catholics where they said, okay, well, our people don't understand Latin, and why are we still doing this service in Latin? And they got rid of the Latin. There's no conversation that I've heard in the Jewish community about getting rid of the Hebrew. There's also no conversation or no really admitting that a lot of Jews don't understand what they're actually saying when they say stuff in Hebrew. So it's both this unifying force, but for newcomers to our community, it's actually can serve as a potential barrier. Because if you had never been to a synagogue before, even if you had walked in last night and this was your first exposure to the Jewish community, wouldn't you assume that, oh, all these people know Hebrew? Because they're singing in Hebrew. They must know what they're saying. So I think that there are we could probably find a few more of those common features, but I wouldn't want to peg that as Jewish. You know, I wouldn't want to say that therefore that means you must have Hebrew to be Jewish. But I think that we could probably find a few more of those common points.
I may be wrong on this, but my understanding is that when Reform Judaism started in the mid-1800s, they did eschew Hebrew, and they wanted to speak in the vernacular, and they wanted their sermons in the vernacular.
And they wanted lots of pork, too.
Well, they served shrimp at the first ordination of the Reform movement.
That's why they're called the good old days, right? No. Sorry.
I mean, so to say Hebrew is the uniter when now Reform are going back to more tradition, and that's interesting to ask. Why?
Yeah,
Why are they now wearing kippot at their services?
And there were some Yiddishists that wanted to replace Hebrew with Yiddish, some even involved in our movement. The challenge is that their second generation doesn't understand the Yiddish, so it might as well be Hebrew.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with the fact. I think the basis statement for our movement is you don't say anything that you don't believe in, and you don't say anything that you don't understand. Therefore, anything that was in Hebrew was also transliterated and translated. And what's interesting is that this is also a commonality with Israel. Surprisingly enough, in Israel, there is a new addition to the Bible. And the new addition to the Bible is in simplified Hebrew. You would think that everybody could read the Bible because most of it is in Hebrew. But today there's a Hebrew translation to the Bible. I think it's problematic at least. But it's certainly an issue. And the other thing I think is very, very important, and that is that understanding must be part of the infrastructure of our education. And I think that what we really need to strive to in educating our families, and doesn't matter who's a member of them, is that we need to try and understand and look at things as they really are. In other words, if we do look at our reality as this wonderful puzzle, and one of the things that are wonderful about a puzzle is that each piece must be different, because if not, you cannot ever put the puzzle together, is that this realization and legitimization of that as part of our culture must be can be the only uniting force in understanding that that's the unity of Jewish culture.
Very nice. Very nice. So I've had a request to introduce members of the panel, and we'll do that at the conclusion of the session, which will be in just a minute, because I want to share how ahead of our time members of our audience are. They're asking questions that we're going to be talking about later this morning without having even heard the talks. One question is asking about how welcoming congregations are today, where sometimes they'll say, you can be a member, but we won't do your ceremonies. We'll take your dues, but we won't marry you. How does that dynamic work in the organized Jewish community? We're going to talk about that. Another question asks about matrilineal descent, where that comes from and how that's articulated. We'll talk about that in a subsequent session. And given the degree of assimilation and acculturation of a great number of people in the 21st century, are not most Jews half Jewish, even if they come from two Jewish parents? And that will also be a topic we'll be covering later today. So I wanted to go through and introduce our panel who is up here today. We will have other facilitators as well who will be facilitating other sessions. So I get to sit a little bit further away and relax a bit. But at the end of our table, we have Rabbi Miriam Jerris of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, who will be facilitating our discussion this afternoon on half-Jewish experiences. We have Paul Golan, Assistant Executive Director of the Jewish Outreach Institute, who will be speaking after the break.
It's associate,
Excuse
but I don't
me.
know what the difference is.
The Associate
I
Executive
went from
Director.
assistant to associate because they had to make up some way to give me a promotion.
Oh, I see.
It's the same job.
More work?
More work, less work.
Yes. Rabbi Sivan Malkin Mas, the Dean of Temurah ISHJ in Jerusalem. Dan Liebenson, who is the Director of Partnership for a New Jewish Future, or Institute for a New Jewish Future, another institute, and formerly Executive Director of University of Chicago Hillel. We have Yoni Saracen, the Midwest Regional Director of Birthright Israel Next, and Yoni and Dan will be speaking this afternoon at 2 o'clock. We have Rabbi Ari Mafik of InterfaithFamily.com Chicago, who is the director of that program. And, of course, to my right, Lynn Davidman, whom we've enjoyed this morning, and I'd like to give her a round of applause for a marvelous presentation.